Chapter 5, Popular Radio and the Origins of Broadcasting. The demise of local radio. The consolidation of stations into massive radio groups like Cumulus and Clear Channel in the 1990s and 2000s resulted in budget-cutting demands from the corporate offices and ultimately stations with less connection to their local audience. But long before that, let's start back in the 1800s and the origins of radio. Maxwell and Hertz discovered radio waves in the 1880s. James Maxwell theorized the existence of electromagnetic waves in the 1860s. He believed a portion of these waves, later known as radio waves, could be harnessed to transmit signals. Heinrich Hertz proved Maxwell's theories in the 1880s and advanced the development of wireless communication. Figure 5.1, the electromagnetic spectrum. This chart can be seen on page 154 in your text, and it shows where radio waves, both FM and AM radio waves, fall on the electromagnetic spectrum. Marconi and the inventors of wireless telegraphy. Guglielmo Marconi received a patent on wireless telegraphy in England in 1896. Meanwhile, in Russia, Alexander Popov made parallel discoveries. Nikola Tesla invented a wireless system in 1892, and Marconi had used much of Tesla's work. Wireless telephony, DeForest and Fessenden. Lee DeForest wrote the first PhD thesis on wireless technology in 1899. His primary interest was wireless telephony. His biggest breakthrough was the development of the Audion, a precursor to the radio, in 1906. Reginald Fessenden, meanwhile, made the first voice broadcast in the early 1900s. Regulating a new medium. With the rise of a new industry came new regulations. The Radio Act of 1912 required all those wanting to broadcast over the radio waves to obtain a license, and it also adopted the SOS distress signal. During World War I, the Navy took control of radio, and corporate heads and government leaders conspired to make sure that radio served American interests. It stayed this way for quite some time, as we'll see in later in this presentation and chapter, that the government and large corporate interests maintained control of radio for a very long time. Regulating a new medium continued. Some members of Congress were concerned about the government having a monopoly over the radio waves. This led to the formation of RCA. At one time, GE was negotiating to sell radio technologies to European companies, but then broke off those negotiations and took the lead in founding the Radio Corporation of America, which came to be known as RCA. RCA then became a monopoly, a corporate monopoly, and gave the United States almost total control over the emerging mass medium of broadcasting. There was heavy government influence, but the government did not own the radio. The evolution of radio. Frank Conrad established the first commercial broadcast station, KDKA, in 1920. Charles, known as Doc Herald, began a station in 1909 that later became KCBS. The U.S. Commerce Department licensed 5 radio stations for operation in 1921. So these were the early commercial radio stations. The RCA partnership unravels. AT&T broke its RCA agreements in 1922 in an attempt to monopolize radio. It then began making and selling its own radio receivers and started WEAF in New York, the first station to sell advertising over the airwaves. AT&T created the first radio network, which then led to GE, Westinghouse, and RCA creating their own radio group in response. Sarnoff and NBC building the blue and red networks. David Sarnoff was a very influential figure in the formation of mass media as we know it today. He was RCA's first general manager. He created NBC, which was shared by RCA, GE, and Westinghouse. The original telephone group became known as the NBC Red Network, and the radio group became known as the NBC Blue Network. Sarnoff and NBC building the blue and red networks continued. NBC affiliates paid NBC to carry its programs. NBC sold national advertising and emphasized national programming. Sarnoff also cut a deal with GM to manufacture car radios. So these were the first radios to be inserted regularly into cars. Merged RCA with the Victor Talking Machine Company. Government scrutiny ends the RCA-NBC monopoly. The FTC charged RCA with violations of antitrust laws as early as 1923. RCA bought out GE and Westinghouse's shares in RCA's manufacturing business. The government accepted RCA's breakup proposal before trial. CBS and Paley challenging NBC. The first attempt at CBS failed. William S. Paley bought a controlling share in the company and launched new concepts and strategies. He hired PR guru Edward Bernays, a iconic figure in the PR industry, used option time to lure affiliates, and rated NBC for top talent. They became the top network in 1949. Bringing order to chaos with the radioactive 1927. The radioactive 1927 stated that stations could only license their channels as long as they operated to serve the public interest, convenience, or necessity. It created the Federal Radio Commission, FRC, which became the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, as we know it today, with the Communications Act of 1934. Activist FCC went after the networks in 1941 and outlawed the practice of option time, demanded that RCA sell one of its two NBC networks. NBC Blue was sold and became the American Broadcasting Company, or ABC, which broke up part of that monopoly. The golden age of radio. Early radio programming had only a handful of stations, offered live music daily, and had 15-minute evening programs, which included variety shows, quiz shows, and dramatic programs. Most shows had a single sponsor. Radio programming as a cultural mirror. The most popular comedy on radio by the 1930s was Amos and Andy. It started out on radio and moved to TV. It was the first show with an entirely black cast, but was canceled in 1953 amid the strengthening civil rights movement. The Authority of Radio, The War of the Worlds. This was a famous broadcast by Orson Welles on Halloween Eve in 1938. It was in the style of a radio news program and created panic in New York and New Jersey. This prompted the FCC to call for stricter warnings before and during programs, imitating the style of radio news. People thought it was a real broadcast and thought that there were actual invaders from another world. Transistors make radio portable. Transistors were small electrical devices that could receive and amplify radio signals. These were the first small radios to be portable. They were more durable and less expensive than vacuum tubes, which were the original precursors to radio, used less power, and produced less heat. These led to the creation of small pocket radios and made radio portable. The FM Revolution and Edwin Armstrong. FM, frequency modulation, radio, discovered and developed by Edwin Armstrong in the 1920s and 1930s. Greater fidelity and clarity than AM, which stands for amplitude modulation radio. Lost RCA's support to TV. The FCC opened up spectrum space for FM radio in the 1960s. This surpassed AM radio by the 1980s. The rise of format and top 40 radio. Format radio was formula-driven radio. This is the beginning of when management started controlling programming and was developed by Todd Stortz in 1949. This is the beginning of the use of rotation and led to the development of the top 40 format, which we still have today. Also signified the creation of the program log and day parts, all parts of programming of radio today. Resisting the top 40. Expansion of FM in the mid-1960s created room for experimenting. The radio waves saw progressive rock, experimental stations playing hard-edged political folk music, album-oriented rock, or AOR, and general classic rock. The sounds of commercial radio. Listeners today are unlike radio's first audiences in several ways. Radio has become a secondary or background medium. Peak listening time is during drive time rather than prime time, and stations are more specialized. And of course, another reason that today's listeners are different is not only lifestyle, but the fact that we have other means of listening to music in addition to radio. We have Sirius XM radio, which allows us to listen to very specialized stations. We have streaming music on our MP3 players. We have subscription services such as Spotify and the new Apple subscription service. So there are so many different ways to listen to music today. And so it's changed the way people listen to radio. Format specialization. There are a variety of formats: news, talk, and information. Music formats today include adult contemporary, contemporary hit radio, country, urban contemporary, Spanish language, classic rock, and oldies. Figure 5.4, most popular U.S. radio formats, ages 12 and up. The largest, believe it or not, this comes as a surprise to those of us in the New York area, is country at 14.8%. We don't have country stations here in New York, unfortunately. Would be nice to have a country station, but they never last. Other, which which is everything that's not listed here, is 11%. News, talk, and information is also 11%. Contemporary hit radio or pop at 8%, which seems very small to me. Seems like in the New York area there are a lot of pop stations. PLJ, Z100, WHUD. Adult contemporary, 7.3%. Classic hits at 5.5%. Classic rock at 5.2%. There are also a few classic rock stations here in the New York area. So those are the top radio formats for ages 12 and up. Nonprofit radio and NPR. Now that I'm in my 40s, I've finally programmed the local public radio station into my car radio. Early years of nonprofit radio. In 1948, the government began authorizing non-commercial licenses and approved 10-watt FM stations. First non-commercial networks, Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. The National Broadcasting Radio, NPR, and the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, were mandated to provide alternatives to commercial broadcasting. And those, of course, have survived to today. New radio technologies offer more stations. As I mentioned in a previous slide, satellite radio, XM, and Sirius merged to become Sirius XM Radio in 2008. That it is accessible through satellite radios, mobile devices, and cars with a satellite band. HD radio enables multicasting by AM and FM broadcasters and provides program data. Radio and convergence. Internet radio, broadcast radio stations now have an online presence. Online-only radio stations like Pandora are growing in popularity. Podcasting and portable listening are a popular way to listen to radio-style programs on a computer or portable music device. Local and national advertising. Radio advertising comprises 10% of media advertising. Industry revenue has dropped, but the number of stations keeps growing. Only 20% of the budget goes to programming costs. National networks provide programming in exchange for time slots for national ads. Manipulating playlists with payola. Payola was a scam where record promoters started paying DJs to play particular records. It was rampant in the 1950s. In 2007, 4 of the largest broadcasting companies agreed to pay $12.5 million to settle a payola investigation by the FCC. So this scandal has continued to present day. Radio ownership, from diversity to consolidation. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 eliminated most ownership restrictions on radio. Together, our iHeartMedia, Cumulus, and Town Square Media own roughly 1,700 radio stations, more than 11% of all radio stations, and dominate the 50 largest markets. They control about 1/3 of the entire radio industry's $17.6 billion revenue. Alternative voices. In the 1990s, activists set up pirate stations to protest large corporations' control over radio. In 2000, the FCC approved non-commercial low-power FM, LPFM stations to give voice to local groups lacking access. The Prometheus Radio Project educates about low-power radio. Radio and the democracy of the airwaves. The influence of radio in the formation of American culture cannot be overestimated. In the early days of the formation of radio, there was a requirement to operate in the public interest, convenience, or necessity. There was a trend of moving away from that kind of public service. So now it can be debated what the current purpose and necessity of radio is today. This concludes the Chapter 5 lecture. There will be further discussion on the discussion boards. I encourage you to read the chapter in its entirety, as you will need to know much of this information for the homework assignments and the midterm.